Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analyst will be listing the top 5 compositions for Set 5 PvE. We're taking a look at the early meta being formed on the PvE for Set 5. We want to be clear that there's going to be a lot of changes between now and the full release of Set 5, so don't expect any of the compositions today to necessarily be the same in 2 weeks. But for anyone wanting to dip their toes into the PvE and need a composition to play, we've got you covered for now. With that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 5, we have HELLION Reroll coming in as the number 5 comp. At the moment, when it comes to playable compositions, well, there's not that many that are quite solidified yet. Whenever a new set drops, it's all about figuring out what the carries are and how best to go about building a composition around them. The first part is still being figured out, so there's not many specific builds being used. Another way that players learn a new set is by playing reroll builds, and one of the most common in the current state of PvE is HELLION. On paper, HELLION looks like a trait made entirely for rerolling. This is because when a HELLION unit dies with the trait active, a Doppel HELLION will pop out of a portal to continue fighting. The unit will come back as 1 star lower than the original HELLION champion, so you may see why rerolling can be quite good. For example, if you manage to hit a 3-star Kled, well, when he dies, then a 2-star Kled will pop out of the portal. With that in mind, rerolling HELLION quickly became an easy strategy for players to adopt right away when the PvE came out. What's even better about rerolling for HELLION units is that they're almost all low-cost units, with the exception being Teemo. Kled, Ziggs, and Poppy are all 1-star champions, so 3-starring them is not that difficult. Kennen being a 2-cost is slightly more difficult but doable, while Lulu is capable of being 3-starred as a 3-cost, though not as often as the other HELLIONs. The core of playing reroll HELLION isn't just to 3-star all of them, which you can, but it's going to take a lot of time and resources unless you're really lucky. Instead, focus on hitting at least Kled 3, maybe Ziggs 3, and Kennen 3. From there, you can play quite a few variations, including going all in on HELLION if you have a spatula item, which by the way requires a shadow bow. But the 2 more common ways of running reroll HELLIONs is either with Kled 3, 5 HELLIONs, and 4 Cavaliers, or a mixture of rerolling for HELLION and Abomination champions. Both variations can do well, but the more common one is Kled 3 with Cavaliers. Let's move on to the composition coming in at number 4, KAYLE Redeemed. This is not an easy composition to play because KAYLE, being a 5-cost, is going to be difficult to hit every game. Instead, what players do is look for a solid mid-game composition and then pivot into KAYLE if they find her. But the overall goal when playing KAYLE with Redeemed is having an ultra late-game carry to win you the game, and KAYLE does that quite well. The way KAYLE works is every few seconds, which varies on her star level, she ascends and gains new functions to her auto attacks. Things like gaining true damage, making that damage AoE, or even gaining immunity for a brief amount of time. So when running KAYLE, the idea is to stall out the fight. Luckily, Redeemed is great for that, specifically because of Rel, who's one of the best frontliners currently. Now, you don't have to play a full 6 Redeemed composition to run KAYLE. Having just 3 is fine for the stat increase, plus you'll likely want at least 1 other Legionnaire for KAYLE to get the bonus attack speed. The rest of the composition can be filled with utility, but as we mentioned, the goal should be to stall out the fight as long as you can, meaning you want a solid frontline. Rel is the best since she's redeemed, but any frontline can do well, such as Volibear with Ivern, Taric, which also provides Verdant with KAYLE, and Nautilus to give your composition Ironclad. One of the best champions to pair with KAYLE is Kindred, as their ability will help KAYLE survive, especially against champions like VEL'KOZ. All in all, KAYLE's not the most reliable champion to use as a carry, since she's a 5-star, but as a late-game carry goes, she's one of the strongest. Next up, we have APHELIOS NIGHTBRINGER as the number 3 comp. APHELIOS is one of 2 4-cost ranged auto-attack champions that you can play as a carry. Draven is the other, and while both of them have a similar role, APHELIOS can dish out damage more consistently at the moment because he can hit more than 1 target with his ability. Draven tends to get stuck on the enemy front line since he only deals damage to 1 target at a time. As we mentioned earlier, there's some really strong frontline champions in the meta right now. There's quite a few ways you can go about playing APHELIOS, but the core of the composition is going to be APHELIOS, at least 1 other ranger, which is generally Kindred, and a few Nightbringer champions. All 4 rangers is fine to run. Keep in mind that the more rangers you have, the weaker your frontline and utility will be. Nightbringer will help keep APHELIOS alive while boosting his damage when the shield procs. Usually you want at least 4 Nightbringer, especially since Nightbringer has a strong early game, so it makes for an easy transition into APHELIOS. You have quite a few choices for Nightbringer, though the overall goal should be to have a strong frontline. Sejuani with Cavalier is an easy choice since you can later play her with Rel. Morgana is all around one of the best frontline champions as she has a large AoE stun. If you can get a bit lucky to 2-star him, God King Darius is a great addition to your comp in the late game. However you mix and match your build, keep in mind the idea is the exact same as the KAYLE comp. Get a solid frontline and keep your APHELIOS alive. Another important part for APHELIOS is items. Without proper items, he's going to do very little in fights. Given the amount of frontline there is with high armor, Last Whisper is an essential item for APHELIOS. You can pair it with an Infinity Edge since those two items do well together, or go for a regular Runaan's Hurricane to help deal additional damage to multiple champions. Lastly, some type of attack speed item is great on Rangers since the boost you get to the trait will be amplified by having a high base attack speed, so Rageblade is a common choice. Or you can try out the new Shadow item like Shadow Rageblade or Shadow Zeke's. Keep in mind that with the Shadow Rageblade, it will deal damage to APHELIOS, so having sustain on him is great. So go for a Shadow Bloodthirster or maybe Hand of Justice. Overall, the goal when playing APHELIOS is to have a backline carry that comes online earlier than KAYLE that can do some AoE damage instead of being single target focused like Draven. Coming in at number 2, we have Abomination. Abomination tends to be a trade that does best in the early and mid game. Monstrosity is hard to deal with by most early game boards, so win streaking with it is quite easy to do, assuming that you hit an early 3 Abomination. Even just 2 of the trait can do well, but don't expect to scale beyond stage 2 if you're not running additional Abomination champions. The real strength of Abomination compositions is when you can have 4 or 5 of the trait active with Kalista, Nunu, Brand, and Ryze. Keep in mind you need the Abomination spatula to hit 5 Abomination. At those tiers, the Abomination is going to chew through most mid-game builds, which allows the Abomination player to safely greed their way to level 9. From there, you can easily transition into any late-game build, a common one being KAYLE. But there's another cheesier version of the Abomination that uses the new Shadow variation of ZZ Rot Portal. Since the monstrosity can have up to 3 items, if you place a Shadow ZZ Rot on 3 Abomination champions, then he'll spawn with 3 of that item. What then happens is he'll dive towards the backline, and upon dying, spawn 3 constructs. Those constructs will then die and explode, dealing true damage to enemies within 1 hex. And that damage is quite high, so imagine having 3 AoE explosions into the backline dealing true damage. Yes, it's cheesy and likely to be changed at some point, so if you're looking to play it, now is the time. For a more regular Abomination game, the core of your build is going to be at least 4 Abomination champions with more well-rounded items. Kalista can hold on to carry items like Rageblade or Bloodthirster, while Nunu gets frontline tank items. The rest of your composition can be an additional frontline, though Volibear pairs well with Nunu and Ivern goes well with Volibear, so those 3 make up a bulk of your frontline. In general, the goal when playing Abomination will be to go on a strong early game run by running 3 of the trait, followed by a strong mid game if you're able to add in Ryze. Then you simply transition into any late game build you want, since you'll have health and gold to do so. And now for the number 1 composition for Set 5 PvE, we have VEL'KOZ. VEL'KOZ started off quite weak on the PvE, but has since been buffed multiple times, to the point where now he's perhaps a bit too strong, as running VEL'KOZ is almost a guaranteed top 2. This mainly has to do with the amount of damage he can do, since his AI for targeting is still a bit off, meaning you can lose with VEL'KOZ if you get unlucky with where he focuses his damage. But for the most part, VEL'KOZ is going to wreck the mid to late game with his damage. Thus, your goal when using him is to keep him alive long enough to do that. Once again, we turn to champions like Rel, Taric, and Ivern, as those 3 are easily at the top when it comes to all-around solid frontliners. Ivern also opens up the door to Invoker, which lets you run Syndra, which gives you 3 redeemed. Whether or not you need Spellweaver with VEL'KOZ is up for debate. Given his base damage, you don't really need the trait to use VEL'KOZ, though having at least 1 other Spellweaver is alright. Zyra fits in nicely with the composition to provide a bit of crowd control to help stall out the fight longer. Instead of Spellweaver, you can also go all in on Redeemed. Redeemed will provide a lot of additional stats for your composition that will help keep it alive longer. Buffing your VEL'KOZ is less of a priority, so you really don't need 6 Redeemed, but it's not going to be a bad variation to run. It more or less comes down to what you hit. If you can form a solid frontline with good utility without running 6 Redeemed, great, but you'll be fine if you're only able to find upgrades to your redeemed champions. One last thing about VEL'KOZ is items. There's 2 aspects you have to keep in mind for him, mana and damage. While his damage is quite high, having a jeweled gauntlet elevates it to another level where he'll be wrecking enemy boards. That's really the only damage item you need, so your other items can be for utility or defense. Spear of Shojin can be helpful to generate mana, especially if you're also running Invoker. Guardian Angel is always a solid defensive option, but Hextech Gunblade may be the best since VEL'KOZ will heal a lot with it. Overall, whichever composition you end up playing on the current PvE, the idea should be to find a mid-game carry and provide them with a solid front line. VEL'KOZ is one of the easiest compositions to do that with, since his damage burns through practically every front line, so all you need to do is worry about protecting him. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. There's plenty of other compositions that you can play on the PvE, but we wanted to stick to just 5 for now, since the meta is in a constant state of change. At the end of the day, we just recommend going to the PvE and testing out the traits and champions to get familiar with it, as that will help the most for when Set 5 fully releases. Let us know in the comment section below which compositions you've been having the most success with on the PvE. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.